Welcome to Mr. Campbell's Global 10 class. Today we're going to be starting the French Revolution, specifically looking at the causes and some of the initial effects of the French Revolution. This is part of Unit 1, The Age of Revolutions, Section 3, Revolutions in Practice. STQs are self-test questions. 1. What role did Enlightenment ideas play in the revolution? This is your easy cause and effect idea for a CRQ, and also kind of fits obviously into a lot of ideas and beliefs and other elements of our enduring issues. Provide specific evidence, like which Enlightenment thinker inspired this idea, which Enlightenment thinker inspired this law. That's really what you want to dig into here. 2, and arguably one of the most important ones, what are the causes of the French Revolution? Can you name them? Can you describe them? Not just list them off, but truly describe how this is a cause of the French Revolution. 3, what is the historical significance of the Reign of Terror, this dark period of the revolution that has captured the minds and imaginations of millions of people the world over? 4, what are the effects of the French Revolution? This is where you would, during issue essay-wise, you would show like significance. This is how the revolution impacted people. And one of them honestly is the Reign of Terror. That's one of the effects of the French Revolution. Without the revolution, there would have been no Reign of Terror. And then 5 is kind of like a philosophical question or an opinion question. Which is better, stability and protection or freedom? And you want to support your answer with evidence directly from the French Revolution. We've got a variety of pictures here that kind of represent the ideas of the French Revolution. We have a very famous picture of the sans-culottes, or those who are without pants, though the amusing reality is they're actually wearing pants. They just weren't wearing those stockings or knee breeches or culottes that were worn by the nobility. We have the Estates General Hall, where the National Convention met, Louis XVI, the King of France, and the storming of the Bastille that kicked off the revolution. So setting the scene, what are the historical circumstances of this time period? Well, France was powerful, a powerful absolutist state. Their kings, the Bourbon dynasty, had total control over all elements of the government, and France was an empire. They had holdings and territories in the New World, some on the African and South American coastline, and they were starting to dig their claws into India, though they were starting to lose ground there to Great Britain. So they were powerful. They had arguably the largest land army in Europe, in continental Europe, and they had a very well-trained army as well. But, however, France was massively in debt. Their government spent way too much money, and they did not take in enough taxes to pay for their debts. One of the other things that had brought them into debt was they helped us during the American Revolution. They paid for arms, gunpowder, weapons, cannons. They sent a fleet over here. They trained some of our soldiers. They had some soldiers come over here and help us. They basically engaged in a war to help us win the Revolutionary War. Maybe not necessarily because they liked us. They really just wanted to stick their thumb in the eye of Great Britain, their historical enemy, and they thought helping colonists revolt against Great Britain would do such a thing, and well, yeah, it did. They had very high levels of social and economic inequality. That means the upper classes, the nobility, were just regarded legally and in every way better off than the rest of France. Economic inequality, the rich were outrageously wealthy. The poor were so very, very poor. They were destitute poor, one step away from starving type of poverty. And that was a large portion of France, both in the countryside, the farmers and peasants, and in the cities where you had like workshops and artisans and people doing guilds and crafts and things like that. Another reason, France's rulers and nobles seemed unwilling to change. They really didn't want to upset this system. They thought it was a great system, that it worked for them. And they lived these outrageous lives of luxury. Remember the Palace of Versailles. This is a whole city built as a palace just for the king and the, cream of the crust nobles. And they're throwing parties and they're drinking. It became popular during this time period for nobles to take baths in crushed strawberries is one of the stories that comes down to us. While people are starving in the cities and starving in the countryside, nobles are having poor people crush strawberries and dipping themselves in it, for it was good for the skin. And your common average French people had very difficult lives, or they were frustrated by the lack of political and economic progress. And these are just maps so you kind of know France and are comfortable with France. You have France here located kind of in the middle of Western Europe, across from the English Channel that could serve as an invasion route, etc. So our cheat sheet: causes of the French Revolution. You have social inequality, a three-estate system that's very unfair. We're going to go into that in more detail in just a second. The aristocracy, or the nobles, had privileges. They had special rights that made them wealthier, just made their lives easier, made them, have a happy life. And the commoners had no rights, literally none at all. There were economic issues, unfair taxation, which is going to come directly from this social inequality, as you'll see. They were highly in debt from expensive wars and luxurious lifestyle of the rich. And they had several poor harvests in a row. That's a key idea, that for a couple years in a row, the wheat and barley harvest, the staple crop that people used to make bread, which is what most people ate, or for porridge, well, the harvest turned out very badly. There was a mold one year. It was too rainy and wet one year, which led to just poorer harvests, less volume taken in. So that's going to drive the price of food up. And if you're already poor and food prices go up, well, you're going to die. Your family's going to die. It's not a good time. Absolutism. All right. They have an absolute government and a lack of political power. There's no voting. There's very strict censorship. And there were no real rights except for the rights nobles had, which was better than everyone else. So this political block on power is going to be a reason and cause of the revolution. Unfair taxation. It's so important. I put it in here twice. Taxation was based on class. The middle class and the poor paid very high taxes. The wealthy, the church, and the nobility paid pretty much no taxes whatsoever. And Enlightenment ideas, that the French Revolution happens at the tail end of the Enlightenment. And so these ideas of John Locke, of Montesquieu, of Voltaire, civil liberties, consent of the governed, the idea of natural rights, well, those are all going to trickle into this kind of hodgepodge of the French Revolution and act as, in part, gunpowder that'll blow the lid right off of France. So, deeper dive into each one of these. Causes of the revolution: absolutism. France had an absolute monarchy. At the time of revolution, it was governed by Louis XVI, grandchild of Louis XIV, of the Bourbon dynasty. That's their last name. That's an easy way the regents could try and trick you, is instead of putting like France or putting Louis's name in there, they just say the Bourbon dynasty, and you're supposed to know that's mostly France, though there are other Bourbons in Europe. And they control everything. The king and his chosen, the elites, the nobles he surrounded himself, they had all political power. The people were denied political power. They had no say in their government. People generally resent that, especially now that the Enlightenment's happened and you have, Rousseau telling the population of Europe that democracy is what should happen, that the people should have all the say in government. There was very strict censorship. No one was allowed to criticize the king. No one was allowed to criticize the court or upper nobles. No one was allowed really to criticize the church. So they actually had like spies and government agents. They would break up printing presses that printed illicit stuff. The Encyclopedia by Diderot, that was outlawed because it had controversial ideas in it. The writings of Locke, Voltaire, a lot of French men from the Enlightenment, their writings were banned from their own country. All right, and here you have a Index Libratorum Prohibitum. This is a list of prohibited books that would be outlawed by both the church, the Gallic Church in France, as well as the king. There was no freedom of religion. The king was Catholic, supported by the Pope in the Catholic Church, and he enforced strict Catholicism. Protestants, the Huguenots, the French Protestants, had been driven out of France Jews had been driven out of France. There were like no Muslims in France. It was Catholic, Catholic, or Catholic. That's it. And you would be very violently persecuted if you were any other religion. And on top of this, commoners had very few rights, pretty much none. Like you couldn't be stabbed in the street, but other than that, like you had nothing. Causes of revolution, social inequality. These are key terms, all right? France operated on what was called the Ancien regime, or the old regime, old way. The other name for it is the Three Estates. Please star and highlight these in your notes. This idea of the Three Estates is radically important to understanding and answering multiple choice, just understanding what's going on in France. This is a traditional old idea. It is left over from the medieval ages. Here's a stained glass from ancient 800s CE Europe that shows this idea. You have three groups, a hierarchy. At the top, you have the clergy, those who pray, right? Priests, bishops, etc. Then you have the second estate. They are the nobility, those who fight and own land. They're at the top too. And then the third estate is everyone else, those who work. And here it's a serf. And that basically, those ideas had not changed. Here's the same thing in France 1,000 years later. You have a cardinal of the church, a powerful noble, and a kind of a middle class third estate guy. And it's important to remember that the third estate, yes, it included peasants, it included urban workers. It also included the middle class and the upper middle class who had education, who had jobs. They just weren't nobles. So yeah, it's farmers, it's merchants, it's also bankers, civil servants in the government, clerks, lawyers, doctors, artisans. It's a lot of different people in this third estate, and they had absolutely no rights whatsoever. All right, so the first estate, clergy, the church, know that word, clergy, church, they are at the top. Then you have the second estate, the nobility, the aristocracy, know all of these words, and the third estate, everyone else. This social inequality expressed itself in different ways. One of them is called noble privileges. This is important to remember because we're going to talk later on during this French Revolutionary period about how these go away. So it's good to have that foil to know, well, what were these noble privileges that were then done away with later? One, they inherited land. Nobles inherited land through their family, and they got wealth from that land. How? Well, cause and effect, they owned the land, so they could charge peasants for using that land and living on it. And if they had a special building like a grain mill, a timber mill, whatever, even a forest to chop down for firewood, they could charge peasants money to do that. They could demand free labor from peasants living on their land. This was known as corvée. All right, so if you have 50 peasant families who live on your land, you can literally tell them, yeah, 2 days a week, you're working for me for free. You need to repair my castle wall. You need to work on my fields to provide me with food. You need to work in the kitchen scrubbing potatoes. Whatever the case may be, this was demanded of peasants. And the time they're spent doing this labor for nobles, they're not working on their own farm. They're not feeding themselves. It makes life very tough. They, of course, demanded both rent and or taxes from peasants. They collected the taxes for the king from peasants, and they also charged them rent for living on their land, kind of like they were landlords, basically. They had access to the best government jobs in the military and in the government itself. They did this through their access to the king at Versailles, so they got the best jobs because they were closest to the king. And the king only thought the nobles were worthy of these jobs. They were the only class allowed to hunt. This is a pretty wild idea because remember I said there were poor harvests. So you have a time period in the 1780s where there's not enough food to go around, and the nobles have these huge forests filled with deer and wild boar and pheasants and different birds. And if you get caught as a starving peasant that you've, with an arrow or if you gun, if you had one, shot a deer, you'd be hung to death. You're trying to feed your starving family, and they would kill you because hunting was a privilege of the nobility. A big one, star it. As a noble right, as a noble privilege, they paid no direct taxes. They did not pay taxes. They are by far incredibly wealthy, very wealthy, millionaires, multimillionaires, and they don't pay taxes. And they were subject to different laws. All right, many nobles were the law. They acted as judges on their own land, as magistrates. That was one of the privileges they had as well. And nobles had a different law code applied to them. It was implied that nobles had some rights. So here's a political cartoon from the time period criticizing this system. You have the noble seated, he's wearing his poor person touching gloves, so he doesn't actually have to have skin contact with a poor person if he has to touch the things the peasant brings him. And the peasant's bringing his rent. He's bringing his sack of wheat and barley that he has to give over from his farmland to the nobles because he's renting on the noble's farmland. And he has other things as well. These look like vegetables from his vegetable garden. And he has to hand these over to the noble. That's how the noble gets his food. He doesn't buy it. The peasants provide it with them. And here you have kind of a chart. It's a little bit older. It's from the 1500s, but it shows the hard life that peasants went through, plowing the land, seeding the land, harvesting, all that stuff, just to have it basically kind of taken away from them. Huge cause of the revolution, star this, highlight it, unfair taxation. Taxes in France were not fair. They were based on your social class. The first estate, the clergy, right, the church, they were 1% of the population. They owned 10% of all the land. All land in France, they owned 1/10 of it as 1% of the population. And they only paid 2% of the taxes. Basically, these were taxes on luxury goods like silk, gold, wine, brandy, a lot of it was alcohol, and like fancy food. And they also charged people money. If you remember, this is the Catholic Church, and they had something called tithe. Tithe was a tax, if you will, or a fee that all Catholics had to and are still supposed to pay the church. It's 10% of your income. 10%. So if Mr. Campbell makes roughly $59,000 a year, $60,000 a year, I'd have to hand $6,000 a year directly to the church, and then the government's going to tax me. So the church is bringing in tons of money from these taxes, and they pay almost none. They also owned land and charged peasants rent to live on their land. The second estate, the nobles, remember, they're about 1 to 2% of the population. They owned 20% of all the land, and they paid nothing. They paid no taxes whatsoever to the government. And they had these special privileges like demanding free labor and demanding taxes from the peasant, which brings us to our last group, the third estate. They are the majority of France's population, and they pay 90% of all the taxes. Your average French person paid 50% of their income in taxes. So 10% goes to the church, 50% goes to the government. That doesn't leave a lot left for, you to buy food or clothing or pay for shelter over your head. Really, really brutal. And you have a political cartoon from the time period that kind of makes fun of this. The third estate is here. They are laying on the ground being crushed by this heavy stone of taxes. Who are they being crushed by? The first estate, the clergy, wearing these robes, and the second estate, the nobility, who's above the taxes because they don't pay any taxes. And one of the most hated taxes, of course, was the gabelle or salt tax. You need salt to preserve food. You need salt to put salt on your food, season your food. And also families were literally forced to buy a certain amount of salt every year that they had to pay a giant high tax on. That's why this tax was universally hated. A fourth problem deals with the economics of France itself. that there were deep-seated economic issues within France that led to them, well, collapsing. One of these is the unfair taxation. That is not a good system that will lead to resentment from the poor and the middle classes that they pay all the taxes. And then massive debt. France is in incredible, obscene debt. Why? Well, one, the lavish court spending. All right, Versailles cost billions of dollars to build, but it also cost millions of dollars to maintain this giant palace. And then there's plays and feasts and parties, all these fun, fancy things, new outfit changes for the king and his court, made out of silk and gold and all the finest clothes. That's all tax money. All of that is tax money being wasted so these rich people can live a fancy life. And that drives up debt because they're not taking enough tax money, so that drives up the debt. Expensive wars. France engaged in a series of wars in the 1750s that didn't really, and also, 1710s as well, that didn't necessarily bring them a lot of wealth, even when they won. Like the War of Spanish Succession, they won, but it didn't really gain them anything. The 7 Years' War, they lost that, and they lost their holdings in North America. The American Revolution, well, they were on the winning side, but they didn't gain the American colonies, so they just spent all this money helping us, which, thank you, France. We probably wouldn't have won without that. We definitely wouldn't have won without that. But on the other hand, it did not help them, didn't gain them territory, and did bring a lot of debt into France. And then, of course, in my opinion, one of the biggest problems is the rich didn't pay any taxes. You have the wealthiest people, the nobles in the church. They have money, they have land, and they did not have to pay taxes because of that unfair system of taxation. So you have all this wealth sitting there in these mansions and chateaus and palaces, and it's not getting used to help the country. And we're going to look at what these economic problems led to and how they increased cause of the revolution. Your average worker was spending half their paycheck or more on food each day. Food was a lot more expensive in terms of like what you daily brought in versus what you spent in the 16, 17, 1800s. So 50% of your paycheck just buys you a loaf of bread and maybe a small slice of meat so you can feed your family each day. Like that's not groceries for the week, that's every day. Then you have those crop failures I talked about, bad harvests in 1788 and 89. There's not enough grain to go around. That causes food prices to rise. Well, if you're already paying half your paycheck for food and another half of your paycheck in taxes, that doesn't leave anything for you to feed yourself if there are rises in food prices. So then you have like bread riots, people smashing open bakeries just to steal food and steal a bag of grain because they're starving. They're not doing this, they're not stealing TVs or DVD players or Xboxes. They're stealing loaves of bread because they're starving. And you had like unscrupulous bakers who would mix sawdust in their bread dough to try and make the grain last longer. You had people purposely not baking enough bread and holding on to their grain because they say, oh, well, the food prices are going up this week and they continue to go up. If I bake bread 4 weeks from now, I'll make a ton of money. So at the height of these brutal crop failures in 88 and 89, workers are spending 88%, 90% of their wages on bread. There just isn't enough money to go around. All right? You have this unfair class system, this lack of rights. All of this combines. The nobles are still eating to the third estate feeling cheated, taken advantage of, and exploited. You have this very famous, phenomenal political cartoon. All right? You have the people of France. They are blinded. All right, their eyes are put out by censorship. Their tongue is tied with a chain by censorship. They are chained to the land by peasant system and the third estate system, which treats them basically like serfs. And then, of course, you have King Louis XVI, and he's got a whip, and he's just whipping them forward, yes, on into the future, dumb peasant. And they're starving. The peasant is so skinny. You can see every outline of their muscle. They look like they've been through a famine. They are in a famine. And then you have the church and you have the nobility riding on the back as well, kind of hitching a ride. So this is the historical circumstances of this cartoon, that the third estate is overtaxed. They do not have enough food. There is strict censorship that blocks them from speaking their mind or even protesting this system. It's illegal. And then our final cause of the French Revolution are the ideas of the Enlightenment. That the Enlightenment, which arguably had its largest growth in France, these Enlightenment thinkers criticized France's absolute rule. That they're like, yeah, this divine right is not a good government. This absolutism is not good. They used reason to say the rights and privileges of the first and second estate were unfair or unjust. Remember that the Enlightenment was obsessed with the idea of justice and equality. And they said, yeah, if you have these certain classes and their lives are considerably better just because of the class they're born into, and that cannot be changed, you can't buy your way into nobility very easily anyways, then that's an unfair system. And then in 1688, England had their Glorious Revolution, in which they basically got rid of a king they didn't like, and they brought in a new king and queen, William and Mary, and they made them sign a constitutional monarchy, an English Bill of Rights, to create a monarchy that was limited. And that was an appropriate challenge to this absolute authority, that the English people, through their Civil War and through the Revolution of 1688, the Glorious Revolution, challenged absolute authority and set up an effective government. 100 years later, England is doing great, right? In 1788, England's doing just fine. They've got a world-spanning empire. Yeah, they lost the 13 colonies, but they still have Canada. They still have chunks of Africa and India. And France is in debt. England was not. They were doing phenomenal economically. So some people are going to say, well, maybe it's this terrible system of absolute rule that is causing us to be poor and in debt. And then the American Revolution happens in 76, and a lot of people around the world thought, A, we were going to lose the war, and we won, and B, that we'd immediately implode into chaos and violence. There'd be no law, no absolute ruler to govern us, and we would just turn on each other like, feral dogs. And instead, we formed a republic, a new form of government, or at least, a newer since the Roman Republic. And we based this new government on ideas of liberty and equality. Again, still we had slavery and stuff, but there was a general equality between, again, only white males of privileged birth who own land. But it was a new form of government. It was wildly more equal, more just than anything else that existed in the world. So these are the two models some French people are going to have to go off of. They say England had a revolution, they have a limited monarchy, and it's working really well. They have a constitution and a limited monarchy, they're doing great. The Americans overthrew their king, and they created a republic that is equal and fair and has a Bill of Rights, and they're doing good too. These are the basis of the French Revolution. All of these, the unfair class system of the three estates, unfair taxation, high debt, Enlightenment ideas, all of this brews a heady stew of revolutionary fervor. So before we get to this timeline, I want us to look at this memory question. Who were some Enlightenment thinkers that would have challenged or criticized France's government and society? If you can, take a second to pause this, write a couple in, and then we'll start again with a couple ideas. Okay, so hopefully you wrote a couple ideas down, and these are what I came up with. I think certainly you would have John Locke, right? John Locke says that all people are free and equal. In France, they're not, right? The peasants, the third estate, are definitely not equal to the first and second. They are definitely lower down. The class system inherent in France says they are lower down. And they're not really free to make their own choices or free from oppression either. So John Locke would definitely oppose this. John Locke would also say that a government exists to protect natural rights, and the French third estate, the peasants, the middle class, they had no natural rights under France's government. So they then are not being protected. They're being denied these natural rights. And John Locke says, well, if your government's not protecting your rights, you have the right to overthrow them. I think Voltaire, who says you should have freedom of press and freedom of religion. France had neither of those things, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, or freedom of religion. I think Rousseau, who says that democracy is the best form of government. Well, France did not have that. They had an absolute monarchy, guided by divine right of kings. And you can have like Cesare Beccaria, the Italian, who said that, you cannot have capital punishment, that you have trial by jury and it should be swift. And France doesn't have that either. So this is a snapshot of the timeline of the French Revolution. I don't necessarily expect that you memorize this, but it is helpful to know the order of these events. And I actually have seen questions that ask you on that. And we're going to go through every single one of these stages, so I don't want you to be overwhelmed now. We will look at each of these in turn and really what they mean as well. So the Estates General. On May 5th of 1789, the king realizes and is told by his financial advisor that France's debt is now so high, they literally cannot function as a government without more money, without new taxes. That's the only way. Their government's going to collapse. So King Louis XVI, who was ruling France at this time in 1789, he doesn't want to just raise the taxes himself, like the king has demanded it. He's an absolutist, sure, but he does realize that raising taxes will only raise them on the common people. It'll only raise them on the third estate, which are the majority of people, about 97, 96% of the people of France, and they will be very, very angry. So the king wants to make it seem as though it's a decision of the people of France to raise these taxes. So he calls a meeting of the Estates General. This was like Parliament for France. It was the lawmaking body that was made up of all three estates. Now, the reason you guys might be like, well, Mr. Campbell, you said they're an absolute monarchy. They are. They hadn't met as an Estates General since 1614. It had been 150 years since they'd met. And the last time they met, it was just another king telling them, you have to raise taxes or I'll start killing people. In the Estates General, each estate, the clergy or church, the nobility, and the third estate, everyone else, had one vote. This is not proportional to the population, right? The clergy were only 1% of the population, the nobles 1 to 2. Everyone else was, well, 97, 96% of the population. So if they only all get one vote, the votes of the people, the actual French commoners, do not really matter if the other two estates ally themselves. So when the Estates General meets, the people, the third estate, which in this case is not like farmers like screaming with their pitchforks, the third estate people that showed up to the Estates General who were invited were merchants, were doctors, lawyers, engineers, artisans. They were well off third estate, very well educated third estate people. And what they did is when they got there and realized that the nobility, the second estate, and the church, the first estate, were going to just vote whatever way the king wanted to increase taxes, no matter what. There wasn't even going to be a discussion of any of France's problems. They said, you know what? We are not meeting with you guys as an Estates General. We, the third estate, are instead the National Assembly. We are the National Assembly of the people. So an assembly of the people of the nation of France. All right, we are France. And they set themselves up with specific goals. They were going to make a new government, a new constitution, a set of principles to base their government on. They are going to create a more equal and just society and a new government for France. Now, they invited the first and second estate to join them. They reached out across the aisle and they said, hey, nobles, this is going to be a glorious endeavor. You should come join us on this. They reached out across the church fathers, bishops, cardinals, priests, You have seen how the people have suffered. Will you join us in the forging of this National Assembly and the creation of this new constitution? And they were pretty much denied. Some of the nobles, most famously Marquis de Lafayette, who fought in the American Revolution and was a brilliant Enlightenment writer as well, he agreed to help the people. And there were a couple priests as well, but for the most part, the church and the nobles said no. The king, King Louis XVI, says, you know what? If these peasants, these commoners, are going to try and meet as a national assembly, I'll just lock them out of the meeting hall. It's hard to be a national assembly when you can't assemble. So he literally locks the door to the Great Hall, the Salle d'Etat, the meeting hall. So this group of commoners then wanders around the palace looking for somewhere to meet, and they finally meet at one of 6 indoor tennis courts. Yes, 6 indoor tennis courts. And they signed the tennis court oath. This is a huge moment in the history of the French Revolution. The National Assembly swore that they would not disassemble or not break apart until they had succeeded at their goal of forging, of creating a new constitution, a new and fair and just government for France. So they're like, you can't stop us. We'll meet. We will agree, we will decide these issues wherever we can. And they swore in a tennis court to create a new government for France. Now, at the same time that all of this is going on, food prices, bread prices are continuing to rise. And the areas arguably most hard hit are cities. Why? You can't grow wheat and barley in a city. It all has to be imported. And if there's a problem in the countryside with not enough grain, less is being imported into the city for sure. So at the same time that news of the Third Estate declaring themselves a National Assembly, meeting in a tennis court and declaring this oath to create a new government for France, there are bread riots in the streets of Paris. Commoners are rioting over food prices. They are ticked. And mobs in Paris turned their attention, their anger, their wrath onto a fortress that existed in the middle of France called the Bastille. It was initially a fortress, like an actual castle, and then as Paris expanded past its walls, really, it became a fortified city prison, specifically a prison for political prisoners. It didn't necessarily have murderers and thieves in it. What it had was people arrested for writing against or disagreeing with the ideas of the church, the nobility, and the king. These mobs attacked the Bastille, besieged it on July 14th, 1789. This is Bastille Day. This is France's Independence Day. Soldiers were sent to stop this attack, but these were soldiers who lived in Paris. So as they lined up with their muskets and looked out at this rioting crowd, they saw faces of people they knew. They're like, that's Johnny down the street. Oh, I know that guy's mom. We can't shoot at these. And while some of the soldiers did fire, many of the French soldiers joined the mob. They literally took their guns and their cannons and they started attacking the castle too. So they take the Bastille. The riot works, especially joined by these skilled French soldiers. They are able to take this fortress, free its political prisoners. It only had 6 people in it at the time, but they freed some prisoners. But the other thing the Bastille had was guns. It had been acting as an armory. So it had gunpowder, cannons, swords, bayonets, and a huge supply of guns. So now this crowd is armed. Now the rioters who had sticks and scythes, for harvesting or rolled up newspapers, now they have guns and cannons. So this is the spark of the French Revolution. That's a question I've seen before. This storming of the Bastille is the spark of the French Revolution. And here you have a famous picture of the militia hosting the heads of the commanders of the Bastille And this was a political cartoon. This was widely circulated in 1789, just a day or two after the Bastille's taking. And here's the head of the commander of the Bastille, and the caption reads, "Thus we take revenge on traitors." That these weren't soldiers who had been defending the fort from a riot. Now they are traitors to the French people because the French people have risen up as this National Assembly. So the game is changing radically in France. King Louis XVI is frightened. The Bastille, a fortress and an armory within the city of Paris, has been taken. The people are armed and demanding changes. He cannot get the Estates General to line up behind him. It's getting crazy. The National Assembly, as a kind of fake lawmaking body, because, again, they're not recognized by the king, they abolish the rights and privileges of the clergy and nobility. So all those special privileges these two groups had, they do away with them. They abolished feudalism, and they started to change the tax system to make it more fair. So the king is forced to agree to these changes. He's like, if I don't, they're going to kill me like they killed the one king in England, King Charles I. So he agrees to these reforms, and the National Assembly starts passing these laws now. At the same time that this is happening, there is a document being forged that will kind of become a guiding document of the French Revolution. One of the authors was a guy I mentioned earlier, the Marquis de Lafayette, this handsome gentleman right here. He was a noble. He was really well educated. He was a brilliant military commander. He had fought alongside American soldiers along Washington himself and became a trusted confidant of George Washington and cut his teeth fighting the American Revolutionary War. And he also had seen firsthand the bravery of Americans, how we were fighting for our freedom and our ideals. And these inspired him. And he hooked up with Thomas Jefferson. Yeah, our Thomas Jefferson. He was living in Paris during this time period. He was basically forging political connections with the French. And they sit down and they authored a new document that would govern French society, the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen. So this is published and created in August of 1789. It is in many ways inspired by the Declaration of Independence, and it contains several key ideas. One, that there are natural rights of life, liberty, and property. Who do you see there? John Locke. That all men are free and equal individuals protected by law. Who's that? Well, John Locke again, basically, protected by law. Got a little bit of Montesquieu, a little bit of Rousseau in there. But do notice it does say men, did not include women. That humans in France, or humans in general, are guided by a social contract. You've got some Hobbes there, you've got some Rousseau. That they are creating a government that has a separation of powers. You've got Montesquieu. Governments exist to protect rights, Locke. There will be civil liberties, and they are outlined in this legal document. Freedom of expression, speech, press, and religion. So you've got Voltaire. That France shall be governed by a democracy, laws expressed by the general will, by voting. You've got Rousseau. And that people shall be innocent until proven guilty. You've got Cesar Beccaria. And this then becomes a guiding document for, supposedly, the government of France. And a rallying cry, a rallying charge of this French Revolution was the saying, liberté, égalité, fraternité. Liberty, equality, and brotherhood. Commoners increasingly were still angry that despite a revolution of sorts, the food prices are still rising, and it seemed like the king was trying to block efforts to bring food into the city and block efforts of the National Assembly. And he had retreated the king to his palace in Versailles. Women, furious at the bread prices that they could not feed their families, marched on Versailles. Women picked up pikes, guns, and even dragged a couple cannons with them. This is the Women's March on Versailles in 1789. And at basically gunpoint, they ordered Louis XVI and his wife, an Austrian named Marie Antoinette, and the royal family to move to Paris, where it was thought they'd be easier to control because the National Assembly was in Paris, because the angry Third Estate, the peasants and urban workers, were in Paris. And, foreshadowing, the king and queen are never going to get a chance to go back to Versailles. This is kind of it for them. Other stages of the revolution, you have moderates are reforming and changing the government. In 1791, the National Assembly writes a constitution, the Constitution of the People of France. It created a limited monarchy. Louis XVI still gets to be king. He's going to be the executive branch. They created a representative assembly, a legislative branch, and they put the church under state control. They also outlawed guilds. You remember guilds last year as organizations of specific types of businesses. And you basically could not enter a trade without joining these guilds. And they said that doesn't allow people to work where they want to work. We really feel it's important that people get to work in whatever field they want. People can change their jobs as they wish. They don't have to join a new guild. So they outlaw the guilds. These are drastic changes. I mean, all of this is just changing stuff that had existed for like 1,000 years, but they're huge. They're going to have a huge impact on France and arguably the rest of Europe. The flight to Varennes and Tulare. So Louis XVI is seeing the writing on the wall. He feels like this revolution is out of his control. Even though there seems to be a place for him in this new constitution, it's not what he wants. He feels like his family's in danger, and arguably they kind of were. And so he tries to flee in June of 1791. He disguises himself, but actually gets recognized because a citizen at an inn recognizes his portrait on a piece of money. He's like, wait a second. He holds a coin in his hand. I know that dude. That dude's the dude on my coin. Get him. And they are forced to go back to Paris. They're captured, forced to go back to Paris. And the fact that they ran away makes many Parisians and many French people feel like they're not trustworthy, that the king was trying to go to Austria or go to one of the other European countries and rally support with other monarchs to put down this revolution. Fearing another escape attack, a mob attacks the king's palace at Tulare, which is in Paris itself, and they're only able to escape death because he had this elite bodyguard of the Swiss. The Swiss were mercenaries, and they basically fought to the death to allow the king to escape. And this actually, it caused kind of so much admiration for this fighting to the death that there's this massive famous monument in Switzerland to the 760 Swiss guards who were killed by the mob at Tulare. You have a French lion, the symbol of bravery, and he is dead. He's wounded, obviously, a spear point sticking out of him, and his paw is resting on the French coat of arms of the monarchy because he died protecting them. But unfortunately for the Swiss, France declares war. The French National Assembly was not wrong. Like, there was a plan to take them out of power and to restore the king. Other European kings in Prussia and Austria and later in Russia began to worry that if the French Revolution is successful, if the people overthrow their king, there's going to be revolutions across Europe. They threatened to use force to restore the French monarchy. This is known as the Brunswick Manifesto. It was a document delivered to the National Assembly that says if the French royal family is not restored immediately to the throne with full power, and if their lives are not ensured, that Austria and Prussia will invade France. And rather than be invaded, the National Assembly says, no, we're going to declare war first. And so this new French government declares war on Prussia, Austria, and Great Britain in 1792. And here you've got this political cartoon kind of saying what the French people think of this Brunswick Manifesto, this demand that they restore the king. You've got one guy putting it in his pipe and smoking it. This guy's like basically burning it. This guy's, well, wiping his tush with it. The French people were not too happy that these other countries were going to force them to bring back the king. So these are known as the French Revolutionary Wars, and they last for years, really. It's a long period of time that these wars drag on and on and on. And in the beginning, they go very badly for France. The Austrian and the Prussian forces actually win several of the first battles and start pushing the French back into France. And they almost make it to Paris themselves. So the revolutionaries become very afraid that, once they lose this war, this revolutionary war, they're going to be rounded up and killed, that life could get even worse for them. And the wars don't go good for France until Napoleon, who we talk about a little bit later. So the wars are going badly. Everyone's looking for someone to blame, and there's no king to really guide anything. The government's a hodgepodge of different committees. There's just a brutal time period of political instability. A key enduring issue to remember this year is that often during revolutions, there are moments of political instability. America had it. We had the Articles of Confederation. That was not politically stable. It was not a functional government, which is why we threw it away and built a new constitution. Moderates in the government and radicals fought each other. And we have a chart here at the bottom that shows you kind of these different viewpoints. Conservatives generally liked how things were. They wanted a limited monarchy and didn't want to change the government too much. They still wanted a king. Moderates wanted some changes. They might have wanted a republic, or they might have wanted even stronger controls on the king, but they didn't want to overthrow all of society. Radicals, or radicalization, they opposed the monarchy. They did not want a king, and they wanted drastic changes in the government. They were talking about seizing all land and property and giving everyone an equal share, stuff like that. And the radicals, especially as the war goes badly against France, they get more and more important, not least which because they had the support of the sans-culottes, laborers and poor people who lived in Paris. They sided with the radicals and they gained control of the assembly. So this political party, and I'd like you to star them, known as the Jacobins, they claim power in the National Assembly. There's more of them voting, so they are now basically controlling the government, this radical group of Jacobins. Radicals opposed any form of monarchy and wanted to basically flip society on its end, and they gained the control. All right, and here's a famous painting that's actually from a different revolution of liberty leading the people. You have the young, you have the sans-culottes in the middle class following liberty, who's carrying and waving the French flag towards revolution and a better future. So now that the Jacobins are in charge, they're going to make some pretty drastic decisions. In 1792, the French held a national constitutional convention allowing universal male suffrage. All males can vote, not just males with property. This is going to help the Jacobins because even the poorest of the poor, who are most likely to become radicalized, they're willing to now vote and staff the National Convention with more people. And what they do is they create a French republic. So no more political instability. You had the monarchy, then you have constitutional monarchy, limited monarchy, now a republic, which lasts from 1792 to 95. They abolish the monarchy. So the rule of the Bourbon dynasty is no more. The king is now just a person. He's no longer legally king of France. They created a form of public education that was free to all, and they outlawed slavery in the French territories. That's going to have some impacts later on, which we'll talk about in a week or so. And now the radicals, led by the Jacobin political party, and eventually emerge out of this new convention and into this new republic with literally all of the power. This leads to some very drastic changes. We said the radicals, the Jacobins, wanted to flip society on its end, and we're going to look at one of the things they chose to focus on, which is religion. The French Republic was broke, all right? Just like the monarchy before, they didn't have any more money, so they had to reform stuff, and they saw the church with its land and wealth as an easy target to get some money to fight these wars. They confiscated or took control over all church land. That's billions of dollars worth of tax income. They started to manage this income, i.e., funnel it into the government. They disbanded monasteries and convents where nuns and where monks lived, and they took those buildings over to use for the government. Some became schools, some became fortresses, some became common living homes, whatever they wanted. But they kicked all the nuns and monks out and said, you don't do anything for society. Go find a job instead of just praying all day. You got to work and you got to do something for France. And then they took control of their homes. They removed the right of the Pope to appoint priests. And this is one of the big ones. They forced priests and bishops to swear a loyalty oath to the French state, that the French government, the French Republic, comes before all else. Anyone who did not comply, who did not swear this oath, were jailed. And then, in a battle in which French soldiers lost, the French people were afraid that these priests would turn against them. They took over the jails and they killed thousands and thousands of priests. You're starting to see this revolution, which started out with noble intentions of freedom and justice and equality. It's starting to get very dark. It's starting to get very mob rule, very riots, very death, blood in the streets type of thing. They also changed the calendar because the old calendar was too religious, and they gave them weird names like Thermidor to all the months. The Jacobins, the radicals, they were successful in changing religion, though it came at gross human rights violations, but they still saw Louis XVI as a threat. As long as there was a king, the king could be restored to the throne by Austria or Prussia, right? His wife was Austrian, so his father-in-law was the king there, and they did not want to see that. So they stripped him legally of his title because they controlled the National Assembly of the Republic, and he was put on trial for crimes against the French people. As Citizen Louis, he was found guilty and condemned to death by guillotine. Guillotine, or the guillotine, would become the major symbol of the French Revolution. It was created by a doctor who wanted to create a fair and equal way to execute people. Historically, people were either, if they were nobles, beheaded with an axe or sword, or if they were commoners, they were hung by the neck until they died, or they were tortured to death. So Dr. Guillotine said, well, let's make something that is equal and ensures death. By the way, having your head chopped off with a sword or axe did not always work. And it was horrific when it didn't work the first, second, or third time of an axe going through your neck. The guillotine always worked. It's a big giant steel blade. You cannot move. It's always going to hit because a human's not, swinging an axe. It's just a big giant blade dropping onto your neck. And I always found this story amazing. There was one guy who did like most of the executions in Paris during this time period. His name was Chief Executioner Charles Henri Sanson, and he is here depicted displaying the head of Louis XVI. He executed 3,000 people. He's the one that pulled the rope, that set this guillotine down, and he killed over 3,000 people in his life. Napoleon, who kept him as the executioner, once asked him, how do you sleep after executing more than 3,000 people? And his response was, if emperors, kings, and dictators can sleep well, why shouldn't an executioner? Wild. Now begins the Reign of Terror, a horrific and violent and terrifying, obviously, time period in the French Revolution. It lasted about a year, 1793 to 1794, when the Jacobins, in full power, are being led by this guy, Maximilien Robespierre. Star and highlight the heck out of his name. He is associated with violence, human rights violations, the Jacobin Party, radicalism, all sorts of terms he can be matched to with multiple choice. And he forms this special group to wield even more power, the Committee for Public Safety, which was not a committee. He ran it, and it did not keep the public safe at all. It's the worst name ever. They eventually basically become the government in Paris. It's a small council. He basically tells people what to do, and they are going to pass this law called the Law of Suspects. All right, it's not really a law so much as something that gets passed by the Committee for Public Safety, but they're running the government, so it becomes de facto law. And it says that any enemies of freedom and traitors shall be arrested and tried. Those arrested were almost always guilty until they could prove their innocence. So this goes directly against the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen, the French document that Marquis de Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson wrote. It's a violation of that document. And this starts the Reign of Terror. Because how do you prove that you're not an enemy of freedom? There's no way to prove you're not an enemy of freedom. All right? It's just people blaming each other. It was crazy. During the Reign of Terror, between 300,000 and 500,000 French people were denounced. People accused them of being traitors or enemies of freedom. They were arrested and they were put on trials. Anyone not radical enough, anyone's like, oh, I miss the good old days, or anyone seen as a threat to the Republic was killed by guillotine. Thousands of French people left. They became émigrés, generally fleeing to other European countries or fleeing to Great Britain. So this is a mass migration, which is also one of our enduring issues. You have human rights violations, these brutal trials where you're guilty until proven innocent. And in the course of this 1 year, 40,000 French men, women, and young adults, teenagers, were executed, mostly by guillotine. Some were stoned to death or beaten to death. Some were hung, but most of them were executed by guillotine. Just brutal. One famous example is several hundred were drowned to death, being tied their hands and feet together and thrown into a French river. In one day, they killed like 800 people by drowning. So just a horrific period. This is how, the French Revolution is significant. This is how the Reign of Terror is significant. Cause and effect, the political instability of the French Revolution led to the Reign of Terror. And here are some political cartoons of the Reign of Terror. The French Revolution, once this radical Jacobin party takes over and launches this Reign of Terror, you have the British saying, well, it's just peasants, and they're drunk off their butts, and they're just cutting everyone's head off. You have the world on fire here. You have the symbols of the monarchy and nobility. You have the symbols of the church being stomped on by these peasants as they kill priests. You have them hanging priests, and this guy is the glory of the French Revolution. He's watching civilization burn as they cut off thousands of heads. So people in the rest of Europe were criticizing this. These are two British cartoons. They saw this as crazy that this was going on because they're hearing the horror stories from people who are fleeing France. The Reign of Terror only ended when Maximilien Robespierre was basically betrayed by other Jacobins, other members of the National Assembly, who are like, this guy's nuts. He's going to come for us eventually. So they signed a warrant for his arrest. He shot himself to try and, forego being guillotined. Bullet enters his neck and jaw, blows off half of his jaw, but doesn't kill him. He spends the next 12 hours in agony, begging for death with this half of a jaw before he too is led to the guillotine and his head cut off. So not a great time for Robespierre, but he was responsible for thousands of his own people's deaths. People wanted stability. After the insanity of one government to another government to another government, and the chaos and fear and terror of the Reign of Terror, people wanted stability and order. The Jacobins are rounded up, many of them are arrested, and, many are executed, quite frankly. And moderates come to power in the National Assembly. Those who wanted some changes but valued stability came to power. And they created a new government. Yes, another new government, known as the Directory in 1795. So in 6 years, they've gone through all of these changes. It had a council of 5 directors, and these were going to enforce laws and bring order. So they got the mobs out of the street. They brought some semblance of law and order. They weren't just having mobs arrest people and kill them. And they also became militarily successful. uh, arguably because of a young general named Napoleon, that he is leading their forces against Austria, against Prussia, and he starts pushing them out of France, and he actually gains French territory and ports in other areas. They set up new law code. Only literate men who owned property could vote, so they took a step back from the Republic, and they used military force to eventually control elections. What happened is the Directory takes power, and everyone kind of agrees with this government because they think it's going to bring order and stability, and then they're in power for a year or two, and they say, okay, well, we're going to have elections, and they think they're going to be reelected because they think they've done a good job. But frankly, people have less rights than they did before, and they still haven't brought the food prices under control. So they actually lose the election, so they just ignore the election. They repress critics, they bring back censorship of the press, they bring back censorship of freedom of speech and freedom of the press, and they start outlawing gatherings of people, outlawing demonstrations. So they basically become just as bad as, well, the king's government.